Picture this. A privileged guy in his early 20s sits in a cafe wearing a sensenmeion suit, propping his feet on a table while a waitress tries to wipe it down. He doesn't acknowledge her. No please, no thank you. He acts as though she isn't even there. What he doesn't realize is that someone in the back corner, behind round sunglasses, has been observing him the entire time. And in about 16 minutes, this young man is going to learn a lesson about basic respect one he won't easily forget. Because the person watching isn't just another customer. It's Ozzy Osbourne. And today, the so-called Prince of Darkness is about to show an entitled rich kid what real influence looks like. The young man who drifted through the cafe's main entrance moved as if he were arriving at a premiere. He was maybe 23 or 24, yet his posture suggested he believed he had personally shaped the landscape outside. He wore a Gucci suit worth at least $3,000, a spotless Rolex, and Italian leather shoes polished so well they nearly mirrored the sunlight. His name was Brandon, and his father owned the city's biggest real estate company. From the second Brandon entered the cafe, he scanned the room with the attitude of someone who thought the space belonged to him, and everyone else existed only as background. Ozzy watched quietly from behind his glasses. Maybe he too had been full of himself when he was young, but life had eventually corrected him. Now he wondered how much reality this young man would need before learning similar lessons. Brandon went straight to one of the best window tables and sat down like he was taking a throne. Moments later, a waitress in her 20s, her hair tied back in a loose bun, walked over. She greeted him with a tired but sincere smile, and said, "Welcome, sir. What can I get for you?" Her tone was so warm that even Ozzy thought he probably hadn't been that polite at her age. But Brandon didn't look up. He stayed focused on his phone. A long pause followed. The waitress waited, still trying to hold her smile. Finally, without lifting his head, Brandon muttered, "Espresso. Make it quick. I'm in a hurry. No please, no thank you. Not even a glance. Just a command." As if the person in front of him were a machine. The waitress lowered her head slightly. "Of course, sir. I'll bring it right away," she said, then walked back toward the kitchen. Ozzy set his cup down and continued watching Brandon. A thought crossed his mind. "Kid, you really have no idea what life can throw at you." But he kept quiet, observing. A few minutes later, the waitress returned with a steaming espresso on her tray. As she approached, Brandon suddenly stretched his legs out and placed his feet on the table. The soles of his shoes smeared the surface she had just cleaned. She froze for a moment. A brief hint of surprise appeared in her eyes, but she stayed calm. She set the espresso down in front of him and said, "Enjoy." Brandon gave a short grunt without looking up from his phone. As she walked away, Ozzy noticed her expression. There was tiredness there. Maybe even a bit of hurt. She didn't complain. She didn't say a word. She simply kept working. Ozzy watched her and thought, this girl is tough. But what Brandon had done brought back memories. Years earlier, he had met people like this backstage. In hotels, in restaurants, wealth and popularity had a way of bringing out the worst in some. And now, this young man seemed to be following that same path. Ozzy took another sip of his coffee and continued waiting. He knew that life sometimes sends the right person at the right moment to correct your course. And today, that person might be him. Brandon kept glancing around as he drank his espresso. His eyes drifted over the other customers. Beside him sat an older couple, and he gave them the same condescending look. Ozzy observed quietly and thought, "Kid, you really don't understand how small you are in a world this big." But he didn't step in yet. The time wasn't right. Brandon needed to reveal a bit more of himself first. A few minutes later, the waitress returned with a cleaning cloth, wiping down tables as she moved through the cafe. When she reached Brandon's table, she asked politely, "Excuse me, sir, may I clean your table?" Brandon looked at her, then at his feet, then back at her. Instead of lowering his legs, he stretched them out even farther. "Go ahead, clean around them," he said casually. "I'm in a hurry. I don't have time to move my feet." The waitress froze for a second. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to respond but stopped herself. She lowered her head and said, "Okay, sir." Then she awkwardly tried to wipe the table without touching his legs. The scene was so ridiculous that a few people in the cafe noticed and exchanged uneasy looks, but no one spoke up. Everyone stayed focused on their own world, until the old man in the back corner slowly stood up. Ozzy Osbourne. His hands trembled slightly, but not because of Parkinson's this time. It was something else, maybe disappointment, because the young man in front of him reminded him of who he once could have become. And now it felt like the moment to teach a lesson. Ozzy walked toward Brandon's table at a calm, steady pace. Several people recognized him, whispering among themselves, "Is that Ozzy Osbourne? Yes, it must be him." But Ozzy ignored the murmurs. His attention was only on Brandon. Brandon finally noticed the old man approaching. As he approached, he didn't seem particularly interested. When Ozzy reached the table, he paused and looked directly at Brandon. A long, quiet moment passed. Then Ozzy, speaking in his familiar English accent but with a soft tone, said, "Excuse me, son, but it looks like we've got an issue here." Brandon frowned and looked Ozzy up and down. "A problem. And who are you?" he asked. Ozzy gave a small smile, one that carried years of experience. "Who am I?" Ozzy replied. "Just someone trying to enjoy a coffee in this cafe, same as you." but here's the difference, mate. I don't put my feet on the table in front of the staff. Surprise flickered over Brandon's face before turning into annoyance. He still wasn't sure who this older man was, but he clearly didn't appreciate the remark. Look, old man, Brandon said, raising his voice, who are you to tell me what to do? This is my table. I'll do what I want. Ozzy tilted his head, studying Brandon with a look that seemed to see through him. He had stood before thousands of people for years, faced every kind of challenge life could offer. Breaking through this young man's attitude didn't require yelling or intimidation. The truth would be enough. I know it's your table, son, Ozzy replied calmly, but respecting this place, and respecting the people who work here, that's part of your responsibility too. He nodded toward the waitress. That young woman isn't here to run circles around you. She's here trying to make an honest living. Other customers were now quietly observing. The waitress stood a few meters away, clutching her cloth, unsure how to react. In her eyes was a mix of surprise and appreciation. Brandon noticed everyone watching and shifted uncomfortably. This has nothing to do with you, he said, though his voice carried less certainty. Just mind your own business. Ozzy slipped his hands into his pockets. They shook slightly from Parkinson's, yet his overall presence was so steady and composed that Brandon's earlier confidence seemed to fade. I'd be happy to mind my own business. Son, Ozzy said, but you know, I used to be just like you, young, famous. Had money, thought I'd taken over the world. Brandon squinted at him. Famous? You, he said with a mocking tone. Ozzy simply smiled. Yeah, son, I'm Ozzy Osbourne. Maybe you haven't heard of me, but I used to have a small band called Black Sabbath. The murmurs in the cafe grew louder. A few customers took out their phones and began recording. Brandon's expression shifted completely. Ozzy Osbourne. He knew the name. His father used to play his music. A legend of rock was now standing in front of him, calling him out. Brandon opened his mouth but couldn't form a response. Ozzy continued, you know, son, I made plenty of mistakes when I was your age. I treated people poorly, thought I was important, and made others feel unimportant. But life taught me something. No matter how much money, fame, or power someone has, no one is above anyone else. We all come from the same earth, and we all return to it. His words were simple and sincere, and a stillness fell over the cafe. Only the distant sound of cars and birds outside could be heard. Brandon sat at his table, unable to move. His feet still rested on the edge, but the confidence behind that pose had completely faded. Ozzy stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. Let me tell you something, son, and I need you to really listen. Those pricey shoes you're wearing, that Rolex, your father's money, none of that makes you somebody. What matters is how you treat people. That waitress right there. He glanced toward her. She may not have your wealth. She may not be known by anyone. But while she's trying to serve you with respect, you're treating her poorly. Does that make you important? Brandon stared down at the floor. Maybe for the first time in his life, someone was speaking to him honestly, and the worst part was that they were right. Ozzy sighed and continued. Let me tell you a story, son. Years ago, after a concert, we were riding back to the hotel in a limo. The driver was an older man. I didn't even bother to learn his name. That night, thousands of fans had clapped for me, shouted my name, praised me. I felt like I ruled the world. And when I got into that limo, I snapped at the driver. Drive fast, I told him. Don't make me wait. He didn't argue, just nodded and kept driving. But when we arrived at the hotel, he looked at me and said, Mr. Osbourne, I may just be a driver to you, but I'm still a person. I have a family, hopes goes, and I deserve respect. I never forgot that. Ozzy met Brandon's eyes. That man taught me something that night, and I've carried that lesson ever since. Now I'm trying to pass it on to you. Brandon was silent. He could sense the people around him watching, but for once he didn't feel proud, he felt embarrassed. Slowly, he lowered his feet from the table and set them on the ground. Ozzy noticed and gave a small nod. That's better, he said. A small step, but it counts. He turned to the waitress. Sweetheart, he said softly, what's your name? She hesitated. Sarah, she replied. Sarah Rodriguez. Ozzy smiled. Sarah, you've shown patience and kindness today. This young man didn't treat you right, but you continued doing your job. That says a lot. You're a true professional. Sarah's eyes welled with tears. Maybe no one had spoken to her like that before. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. Ozzy looked back at Brandon. Now it's your turn. You owe her an apology. Brandon lifted his head. Inside, he felt torn. His ego insisted that apologizing was weakness, but his conscience knew Ozzy was correct. After a long pause, Brandon slowly rose to his feet. Sarah, he said quietly, I treated you terribly. I'm sorry. Honestly, you're here working hard, and I acted like an idiot. Sarah looked surprised. She hadn't expected sincerity. Thank you, she said. I appreciate that. Brandon sat down again, running his hands over his face. Ozzy considered saying more but chose not to. Sometimes silence teaches better than any words. Instead, he turned to Sarah. Could you bring me an espresso as well, love? He asked. And one for this young man? My treat? Sarah smiled. Of course, I'll bring them right out. Ozzy returned to his table and sat quietly. His hands trembled a little, but inside he felt calm. Maybe he had helped this young man, even in a small way. Maybe Brandon would remember this day. A few minutes later, Sarah came back with 2 espressos. She set one in front of Ozzy and the other on Brandon's table. Brandon looked at her. "Thank you, Sarah. Really?" She nodded before returning to her work. Ozzy watched as Brandon lifted his cup and took a slow sip. Then the young man glanced toward him. Their eyes met. Brandon gave a slight nod, and Ozzy returned it. No conversation was needed. Everything had already been said. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the Ivy Cafe's terrace. Gradually, the customers went back to their own conversations. But everyone present had witnessed something, a simple but meaningful moment. One that showed how a legend could influence others, not just through his career, but through his character. Ozzy finished his espresso, stood up, and took out his wallet. On his way to the register, he passed Sarah. "You're an amazing person, Sarah," he said. "Don't ever forget it." With bright eyes, she replied, "So are you, Mr. Osbourne." "So are you." Ozzy smiled and stepped outside. The warm Los Angeles afternoon felt a little more significant. Brandon remained at his table, deep in thought. His cup was empty, but he still held it. For the first time, he began reflecting on who he had become, who he wanted to be. He'd come in for a simple coffee, but instead he'd received one of the most important lessons of his life from a rock legend, of all people. Sometimes wisdom arrives in unexpected ways, and sometimes, a lesson shared over a cup of coffee can make a real difference. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that true greatness begins with humility, consider subscribing to Prince of Darkness Stories. And let us know, do you think Brandon truly changed after that day? Or what would you have done in Ozzy's place? Because even a single moment of courage can make the world a bit better.